thank you very much, and it's great being here this morning. I guess I am here to present a contrary view from what is the norm in talking about climate change, the Kyoto negotiations leading up to the Copenhagen negotiations. And I guess by way of background, I can say that I have been a veteran of the climate change wars ever since then Speaker Newt Gingrich named me as the chairman of the congressional delegation to Kyoto in 1997. And I'd like to thank the Institute for 21st Century Energy for inviting me here today. I led the U.S. congressional delegation to Kyoto and was the only member of the U.S. House to attend last year's UN convention in Poznan, Poland. I have closely followed negotiations since Poland, and I fear that we're heading toward a repeat of Kyoto, namely an environmentally ineffective agreement that cannot be ratified by the United States Senate. At a congressional hearing earlier this month, Chief U.S. Negotiator for Climate Change Todd Stern described the growing tension between developed and developing nations. This tension will exist as long as countries approach to climate talks with unrealistic expectations. India's government, for example, says that the West owes billions of dollars to developing nations to compensate for climate change. In its submission to the UN, the Indian government argued that this funding should be a legal obligation for developed countries that cannot be subject to decisions of developed country governments or legislatures. They added that the funding should not be in the form of loans, that the providers of finance cannot be discretionary donors, but must be legally obligated assessors. In its own submission, China argued that developed countries should provide new, additional, adequate, predictable, and sustainable funding of at least 0.5 to 1% of the nation's gross domestic product over and above existing foreign aid. Developing countries are also attempting to weaken intellectual property rights by seeking to gain free access to American, European, and other developed countries' IPR for clean energy technologies. Their proposals include preventing patenting in developing countries, requiring compulsory licensing, and ensuring access to new technologies on non-exclusive royalty-free terms. All of these proposals ignore the fact that new technologies will only be developed if companies have an incentive to create them. Finally, developing countries have demanded that developed nations reduce their emissions by at least 40% below 1990 levels by 2020. Cuts of this magnitude could only be achieved by destroying developed countries' economies and indeed the global economy. Meanwhile, no treaty can be environmentally effective without global cooperation. Business as usual projections show that even if developed countries reduce their emissions to zero, global emissions will be higher in 2050 than they are today because of increases in the developing world. Todd Stern called this the unforgiving math of accumulating emissions. In spite of this math, most developing countries say they are unwilling to undertake any emission reductions in the absence of developed country funding or free technology. As I told Mr. Stern at our hearing 2 weeks ago, this flunks the good deal test. My point isn't to disparage developing countries or the legitimate efforts that they have made to reduce their emissions. I applaud their progress, but increasingly developing countries seem to view climate change as a methane-spewing cash cow. Politics are the art of the possible. Proponents of a new Kyoto-like treaty in Copenhagen have moved beyond not only what's politically possible, but also what's actually possible. Market forces can work to create technologies that reduce emissions and increase energy independence, but they can't be manipulated to magically produce politically expedient results. As politicians, we can compete to announce the greatest reduction goals. We can even agree to an arbitrary cap, excuse me, that promises these reductions. but we can't produce the technologies that are needed to make them happen. Excuse me. Short of outright economic collapse, new technologies are the only solution to climate change. These technologies will exist only if the business community has the incentive to develop them. Affordable energy fuels economic growth, and economic growth is the engine for innovation. For this reason, taxing energy is the exact wrong approach. A guiding principle that both developed and developing countries should recognize is the right of every country to pursue its own economic development. China and India have both openly stated their primary concern is their own national development. And this is the appropriate focus, but they must also recognize the need for the developed world to pursue the same goals. As our unemployment climbs to double digits, the United States cannot agree to a treaty that will ship more jobs overseas. Every country has the right, and every government has the obligation to pull its citizens from poverty and to advance their way of life. The recent global economic downturn starkly demonstrates that wealth isn't a fixed pie. It can increase or decrease in absolute terms, and American prosperity doesn't come at the expense of the world. The entire economic world can grow, but all that growth must be subject to the same limitations. The developed world cannot agree to self-imposed costs while foreign markets grow freely. The result is too predictable: a long-term contraction of the global economy coupled with a continued explosion of global emissions. In the face of intense pressure to find a solution, we cannot adopt a costly one that won't work. We are victims of our own affluence if we converge by jumbo jet to a modern city and agree to curb our economic growth. It is prosperity that has funded the science that counsels us to change, and it is increased prosperity that will fund the technological advancements that will help us achieve them. Negotiators have just 16 days of scheduled talks before the UN COP in Copenhagen begins. At that time, I urge the parties to focus on cost-effective solutions that will reduce emissions while fostering global economic health. These are the types of solutions that are politically possible and politically sustainable in any democratic country. And with this principle in mind, the world can begin to identify viable solutions to address climate change that pass the good deal test for everyone involved. So I thank you for your attention this morning, inviting me here, and I'll be happy to spend maybe 20 or 25 minutes answering any questions or listening to any comments that any of you may want to make, and who'd like to be first?